Evening. Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear the microphones working. Good evening and welcome to the 4th annual Sid Easley Memorial Lecture, sponsored by the Sid Easley Lecture Fund. My name is Marjorie Hilton. I am the interim chair in the Department of History. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Easley family for establishing the Easley Fund, which makes this lecture series possible. I'd also like to thank the following people for their help organizing tonight's event: Jim Humphries and Tori Herndon, both in the Department of History, Tina Burnot, Carol Brunn, Jacob Paul, and everyone in the Development Office. And also, thank you to the donors to the Easley Lecture Fund. Thank you. Okay, before we hear from Dr. Smith, I'd like to take about 10 minutes to recognize the accomplishments of my colleagues in the Department of History and also some of our students. So, over the previous year, history faculty have published many outstanding works of historical scholarship, and I don't have time to mention them all, but I just want to give you all a shout out. So Dr. Selena Gao, who won the Outstanding Researcher Award in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, published an article on folklore studies in Republican China in a journal by the name of Frontiers of History in China. Brian Clardy's article on lynching in America appeared in the Journal of the Jackson Purchase Historical Society. James Humphries edited a book of essays on the New South and co-edited an issue of the Journal of the Jackson Purchase Historical Society. Dr. Aaron Irvin edited a collection of essays titled Community and Identity at the Edge of the Classical World. Dr. Christine Lindner had an essay called Women and Christianity in the Middle East. It was published in a collection entitled Christianity in the Middle East. Dr. David Pizzo co-edited After the Imperialist Imagination, which is a book of essays devoted to scholarship that places Germany in a global context. Dr. Eleanor Rivera, I don't think she's not here, had an article that appeared in French Historical Studies on the curious case of classroom crucifixes in France at the turn of the 20th century. And finally, Dr. Matt Robertson, you're here somewhere, there, published an article on the transformation of paradigms of sovereignty in pre-classical India in the Journal of Hindu Studies. And those are just some of the outstanding things that my colleagues and I did over the past year. So we also have many outstanding history majors and history minors, and the department is fortunate to have 2 scholarship funds to help support them. The first, the James W. Hammack Jr. Scholarship, is named in honor of the late Hammack, who was a pioneer in the field of oral history and an MSU faculty member for over 30 years. The Hammack Scholarship supports graduate education in history. For the 2021 academic year, 2 MA students in history have been awarded the Hammack Scholarship. And when I call your name, would you please come forward? Madeline Isley and Matthew Hoskins. I've got to find it, Madeline. Okay, Madeline, do you want to come on this side? I think someone's going to want to take a photo. And Matthew? So the 2 Hammack scholars for 2021 22. I said that wrong, didn't I? It's 2021-22 this year. Okay. And then we have the T. Wayne Beasley Memorial History Scholarship, which supports history majors in their senior year. The four recipients, I can't say that, the four recipients of a Beasley Scholarship this year are Morgan Bryan. Oh, there she is. Maya Noonan. Congratulations. Megan Overholt. Congratulations, Maya. Congratulations. And Jennifer Whitehouse. Congratulations. Join the move. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Easley, who will tell us about his father, Sid Easley, and the founding of the fund.
Good to see all of you all here this evening. My dear father always loved a good family conversation. Admittedly, they were frequently bolstered by several cups of coffee if in the morning or several glasses of red wine if in the evening. My brother Don and I began to refer to them as queries, family queries. Nothing was off the table for discussion. The subjects were often wide-ranging, open-ended, sometimes international, and most of the time inclusive. Dad had a knack for provoking without preaching, teaching without being dogmatic. And my Turkish-American wife says she misses these times with Dad the most. By the fireplace, in the big room at 1610 Loch Lomond, hearing his wise words fill the room with an active, historical voice. This evening, my mother, Melissa Easley, and our entire Easley family honor my father, Sid, with the distinct pleasure to have as our guest speaker for this, the 4th Annual Easley Lecture, Dr. John David Smith, Charles H. Stone Distinguished Professor of American History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Dr. Smith will speak with us tonight on James Forman's Black Manifesto, a miroir noir before the conscience of American Christianity. As a philosophy major in university, I worked one summer for Dad in the law firm searching titles at the Callaway County Courthouse. And Brian and Mr. Perlow, I hope you have not come across any mistakes and failings I am certain to have made. If so, send me the liability penalty. I'm sure my hefty government salary can cover it. Dad's love of history and genealogy had set him on a hunt in courthouses across West Kentucky to learn more about our family and their life's work in this unique region. He was stunned one day to find in an aged and yellow-tinged deed from Graves County Courthouse the clearly recorded names and estimated ages of slaves the Easley family once owned and sold. Not long after this discovery, he took me aside and showed me a copy he had made of the deed. He did so with a look of deep spiritual and moral conflict. It was indeed a crisis of his Christian conscience. Several I had seen over the years in his eyes as a progressive long attempting to learn about and perhaps even resolve for himself the deeper complexities and darker mirrors of the American South. But his look this time was different, his aura more melancholy. I had rarely seen this in his always thoughtful and hopeful gaze. That look, which included no words or commentary thereafter, stuck with me and always will. Most simply and purely, my dear father would delight in the themes to be presented in tonight's lecture and discussion by Dr. Smith. It is a wonderful family query. Murray State was family to Dad, and we feel Dad's presence here with us this lovely autumnal evening at Murray State University. My mother, Melissa, and our entire family, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight. It is a great honor for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. John David Smith, the Charles H. Stone Distinguished Professor of American History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. A Brooklyn, New York native, he studied Southern and Civil War history with Charles P. Rowland at the University of Kentucky, where he earned his Ph.D., and has taught at several universities, including North Carolina State and Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, Germany. Dr. Smith has published 31 books, including An Old Creed for the New South, Pro-Slavery Ideology and Historiography, 1865 to 1918, The Dictionary of African American Slavery, Slavery, Race, and American History, Black Judas, William Hannibal Thomas and the American Negro, Black Soldiers in Blue, African American Troops in the Civil War. And his resume goes on and on and on. Books, articles. He has a very impressive resume that he has built over the years. I many times say Dr. Smith is such a hard worker, but it's really not work for him. It's part of him. It is something that he has always done ever since I met him at North Carolina State when I was 24 years old and saying a lot of dumb things about history. Dr. Smith has received many awards for his scholarship and teaching, including the Mayflower Society Award for Nonfiction and the Gustavus Myers Center Award for the study of human rights in North America. And he's currently working on an intellectual history entitled More Than 40 Acres and a Mule, The Case for Slave Reparations in American History, to be published by Oxford University Press. And I should say that for me, there's no one more important in my career than Dr. Smith. He has been a great mentor to me for many years, and he's also been a great friend. I've asked his advice on many things, even a few of them related to history. And you remember the people who are there when the chips are down during the dark times. Some people don't stay with you, but Dr. Smith has stuck by me, and I've stuck by him for many years, and I've learned a great deal from him about history and about life. So it is with great thrill that I introduce him to you tonight to speak on this topic of slave reparations, Dr. John David Smith. I'll try. Okay. Thank you.
I was really touched to see the students receive their awards tonight. What a wonderful thing to honor the students. Jim was my student, and he remains not my student. I respect him very much as a historian and as a fellow human being. But that relationship I had with Jim Humphries as my student and my friend is priceless. I want to thank the Easley family for endowing this lecture series and its other contributions to the field of history and to this wonderful university. This is my third time speaking at this school, and I've enjoyed myself every time. There have been excellent historians here, and I know I did my homework. Jim always told me to do my homework. I know what a strong history department you have here, many talented scholars. And I know about Jim Hammack, who I never had the privilege of knowing, but I know of him, and I know his pioneer work in oral history and methodology, widely respected. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and thank you for the kind invitation. As a preface, I want to just talk briefly about the kind of work that I do. Jim was very kind to mention a number of my books, but the leitmotif rolling through those books and my articles and whatever I've done has been the question of race. Race. I've been attracted to the question of race because of its complexity and because of its always timeliness, usually used in a negative way and poorly defined. Yet I've always been interested in the complexity of race and racial thought, and why people enslave, commit racial violence, racially motivated violence, and why people can't bring people close. Instead, we use something as artificial as race to push people apart. The late, great African-American historian who I was privileged to have as a friend, some of you know of John Hope Franklin. I get goosepimples just even mentioning John Hope Franklin because he was a friend. And when I wrote the book Black Judas, he was blurbed on the back cover of one of the paperback editions, and he said that I had immense courage to write that book. I disagreed with John Hope Franklin, which is something was very hard for me to do because he was like an intellectual father to me. I said, John Hope, it wasn't courage. It's what historians do. We ask questions. The easy part is doing the research, and the hardest part is explaining what this all means. Tonight's lecture deals with reparations, which is, as you'll soon find out, is nothing new. My forthcoming book goes back to the 18th century and looks at African Americans who demanded compensation for their enslavement and for what white people were doing and had done to them. I'm going to take one little corner from my forthcoming book and talk about it. I want you to understand that some of this is going to be very raw. Racial relations, racial thought, racial actions, unfortunately, by the very nature of using race to divide and to exploit and to differentiate and to marginalize is raw, but to ignore the complexities of the past, as Socrates said, is to be ever a child. And I hope that you'll listen closely to what I have to say because it's very complicated. Here goes. In 1969, James Forman, the bearded and graying veteran civil rights tactician and director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you know that as SNCC. Forman was a famous Mississippi project director of the Campaign for Civil Rights in Mississippi to combat white racism. He was the organization's former executive secretary, and as some of you know, he was a member of the Black Panther Party. Forman launched the modern slave reparations movement in the 1960s. In doing so, he sparked ongoing debates over the moral, legal, ethical, and social meanings of reparations, debates that resonate loudly today, as you know. Forman, his dates were 1928 to 2005, had a long record as a radical black activist and Marxist. He had been arrested in 1962 in Albany, Georgia, and a year later, police in Birmingham attacked him physically, brutally. Forman was a member of that Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He marched with the Reverend Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and also ventured to Africa to attack apartheid and colonialism. In the first half of the 1960s, Forman garnered a national reputation as being fearless, ubiquitous, bold, explosive, and ready for action at anyone's call. As the civil rights movement became more militant and nationalistic in the 1960s, Forman moved beyond SNCC, articulating a non-integrationist, assertive, revolutionary ideology emanating from black people during the late 1960s who were demanding reparations. And thank you. On May 4th, 1969, Forman took the dramatic step of interrupting the Sunday service at Riverside Church. Some of you have probably driven by there or attended services there on New York City's Upper West Side. This was one of America's, and remains one of America's largest, most prominent interdenominational reform congregation. Forman briefly took over the church service and insisted on reading from its chancel his soon-to-become famous Black Manifesto. See Eric Lincoln, the distinguished African-American theologian and student of the history of Afro-Protestantism, also a distinguished Duke University historian, wrote that following Forman's takeover of Riverside's pulpit, Western Christendom reverberated with the shock waves of the incident. In a most startling manner, Forman presented his ideals of reparations, demanding payment from wealthy mainstream institutions for centuries of past suffering and exploitation of black persons by white persons. Overnight, Forman and the Manifesto were front-page news from coast to coast. Forman designed his hyperbolic manifesto to call attention as a clarion call to underscore past injustices toward black persons, to publicize his reparations movement, and to arouse controversy. He liked to throw bombs. As one commentator observed, before Forman's disruption of the Riverside Church's service, most appeals for reparations came from wearers of dashikis, not wearers of three-piece suits. The mid to late 1960s, and I can remember the mid to late 1960s, were a period of increasing racial polarization between black persons and white persons. America's cities seemed to be exploding. Race riots in Watts in Los Angeles, Chicago, Newark, Detroit, and elsewhere underscored the mounting civil unrest and increasing militancy within black communities nationwide. In March 1968, in its landmark report, the famous Kerner Commission asserted that America suffered from cancers of racism, violence, and poverty, becoming two separate and unequal societies, one white, one black, one prosperous, one poor. Massive and sustained economic change held the key to beginning to remedy numerous economic and social evils in black urban communities. These included, and you know them, unemployment and inadequate education, inferior housing, discrimination by law enforcement, and the double standard black persons experienced in courts of law, to gratuitous crime and violence on the part of black persons by white persons. Proponents of what became known as the Black Power movement emphasized not progress since emancipation, but rather retrogression, not acceptance by whites, but rather rejection. White racism, they charged, blighted their lives with a sense of hopelessness and despair. Forman demanded from Christian and Jewish congregations, in his words, part and parcel of the system of capitalism. He wanted a piece of the action. He demanded, when he overtook the church, that white institutions pay black persons $500 million in reparations. This comes to $15 per nigger, he said. Those were his words, adding, this is a low estimate, for there are probably more than 30 million black people in this country. He continued, again his words, $15 a nigger is not a large sum of money. And we know that the churches and synagogues have a tremendous wealth, and its membership, white America, has profited and still exploits black people, his words. Forman considered the $500 million only the start of what white Americans owed black people, his words. Underneath all of this exploitation, the racism of this country has produced a psychological effect upon us that we are only beginning to shake off. We are no longer afraid to demand our full rights as a people in this decadent society, close quote. The $500 million in reparations would not go to individuals, not distributing money to individuals, but rather to black concerns and institutions. And he had a menu, which I think you might find interesting. I hope so. $200 million would go to a Southern land bank to assist black farmers. $40 million would go to initiate black publishing and printing houses. $40 million would go to construct black television networks. $30 million to establish a research skills center to assist poorly educated black persons. $10 million to create a national welfare rights organization. $20 million to provide a national black labor strike and defense fund. $20 million to launch what he termed the International Black Appeal, to stimulate cooperative business ventures between the United States and Africa, and $130 million to endow a Southern black university. Forman conceptualized each program to remediate the historic legacy of slavery and the white racism that lay at its core. Forman urged blacks to act boldly in confronting our white oppressors, including seizing the offices and equipment of white religious congregations and staging sit-ins at selected churches and synagogues. The principle of self-defense should be applied if necessary, Forman added. Although he hoped that Christians and Jews would respond to the demands of his manifesto, he hoped with peace and goodwill. Forman insisted that blacks nevertheless were prepared, his words, to declare war and fight by whatever means necessary. Here's some irony. Ironically, the interracial Riverside Church and its lead minister, the Reverend Ernest T. Campbell, had long supported the destitute. It's on the fringes of Harlem. It's on the west side. If you've ever driven on the West Side Highway, I'm sure many of you have, where Grant's tomb is. By the way, Grant is buried there. That's why it's called Grant's tomb. This church The famous Riverside Church had long supported the destitute, serving black, white, and Hispanic worshipers, and providing residents in nearby Harlem with educational and social programs. Its left-leaning, i.e. progressive, forward-looking members of that church opposed the Vietnam War and supported the Southern freedom struggle. If any congregation was ready to hear the manifesto and take it seriously, it was the congregants of the Riverside Church. When, however, Campbell arrived at the church at 11 a.m. on May 4th to preach, Forman and 6 aides already had entered the church and unhesitatingly walked through the sanctuary toward the altar. As Forman approached the pulpit to read his manifesto, a stunned Campbell and roughly 1/3 of his flock walked out. Once Forman had left Riverside, Campbell returned to his pulpit and, in the spirit of racial reconciliation, endorsed Forman's cause. The principle of reparations has sound theological underpinnings, he said. Most Christian churches in the United States feel penitent about what the white man has done to the black man in the society. Restitution is an integral part of penitence, so said the Reverend Campbell. He openly sympathized with paying reparations, explaining that most Christian churches had overemphasized private religious experiences and paid short shrift to basic societal injustice. Payday has come, the Reverend Campbell said. What the price should be and how and to whom it should be paid are questions properly before the house. He meant his church. Having said this, Campbell sharply criticized Forman's forced entry into his church, a move that left Riverside Church officials edgy and stung by the implication that they were not doing enough for the black poor. Church attorneys affirmed its intention to file a complaint against and to seek the arrest of any who intrude themselves upon a service of divine worship for the purpose of public worship than to seize it for their own purposes. So there's a lot of tension here. Campbell and his flock favored reparations, but they didn't accept and would not accept the mode in which a black radical Marxist revolutionary wanted to espouse it. Like any good preacher, Campbell responded formally to Forman's coup in a sermon, The Case for Reparations. The preacher informed his congregants that reparations were nothing to fear. Rather, the concept was as old as the book of Exodus and as current as contemporary jurisprudence. Campbell stressed the ubiquity of racial discrimination and regretted that although white Christians had the power to make amends collectively, they had failed to do so. Campbell admitted to his church that he agonized over paying money to remedy past sins. How can damage to a man's soul be repaid by money, he asked. It can't, Campbell replied. What we have done to the black man in this country is beyond repayment in terms of dollars and cents. We untribed him. We unfamilied him. We unmanned him. Those were his words. While money could never repair whites' past sins, Campbell went on in his sermon, our money can be an earnest of a good intention and hint at a new direction, not only for the church, but for the nation. Campbell agreed with critics who charged that the church should not support revolutionary acts. But Campbell dismissed Forman's Marxist rhetoric as mere window dressing, an attention-getting device that has served its purpose and ought to be honorably retired, so that we can get on with the business of making reparations that lead not to revolution, but to reconciliation. Rather than begrudge reparations, the Reverend said, I should think that we should rejoice that our sin is reparationable. Reparationable. We still have time, and history has remained sufficiently set to allow us this response. Perhaps not surprisingly, Forman's manifesto elicited wide commentary. The Ann Arbor News reported the indignation that might have been expected appears to center more on the way the demands were presented than on their substance. The New York Times dismissed Forman's call for reparations because there is neither wealth nor wisdom enough in the world to compensate in money for all the wrongs in history. Forman also received many letters applauding and denouncing his manifesto. From North Carolina, Edwin Bowditch explained, "Long have I considered the plight of the colored man in the country. The manifesto's demands were acceptable if undertaken in a reasonable fashion. He offered to connect Forman with a printing plant that was available for sale at a very reasonable price." You'll recall that Forman wanted to start a black publishing house. That said, Bowditch urged Forman to have faith in miracles, just as Jesus had when he fed the multitude with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Why not follow this God rather than the God of materialism, he asked. Bowditch signed his letter, "Just one white man among so many." Word of Forman's manifesto reached Montana, where a conference of Methodist women contributed, they sent a check for $82 to the reparation cause. The reaction of many of us, they explained, was one of outrage because you ask ransom and advocate the overthrow of the United States government. Nonetheless, the ladies explained to Forman, "We deplore the treatment the Negro has received for generations and want to change that now," and the "now" was in caps with an exclamation point. "We feel that black racism would be as unjust as white racism. We do not believe in subjugating any people. However, we must admit that this has been done. We realize your anger is justified and your lack of patience is understandable. We ask your forgiveness. We want to put our money, the $82, where our mouths are and to show that we do care. We hear your hurt and pain and desperation and want to respond. Please accept this money in the spirit it is given, one of love and concern." Probably not surprisingly to you, Forman received quite a bit of less supportive commentary. One letter that I found in Forman's papers at the Library of Congress was from an anonymous New Orleans resident. If the correspondent who signed the letter, one of the unsilent majority, this was the nom de plume of the writer from New Orleans, one of the unsilent majority wrote, "If the Negroes are entitled to reparations for damages suffered dating back to the Civil War, then aren't the families of whites whose grandfathers, granduncles, descendants, whose people fought for the North to free the slaves and in the process lost their lives, their fortunes, their futures, aren't they too entitled to reparations? ? The Louisianan next made clear their point. Your so-called reparations are just a euphemistic term for blackmail. We've had it all now. Black power, black is beautiful, Black Panthers, black militants, now blackmail. You aren't fooling anyone. Obviously, this is a long quote. The whole thing smells so badly, I think I'm going to throw up. The writer closed their letter with these words, with disgust that the proud Negroes in our country have to be dragged down by such tactics. A white person who proclaimed to be living on Social Security wrote Forman, describing as utterly ridiculous the reparation campaign for so-called injustices perpetrated on blacks. The writer charged Forman with naivete for working under the delusion that blacks have been in a class by themselves where injustices and exploitation are concerned. Rather, throughout U.S. history, all manner of laboring groups have been exploited, including white children, minors, Chinese immigrants, and Native Americans. The writer concluded his letter, it's all a part of man's inhumanity to man. Upon learning that the Episcopal Church had awarded $200,000 to Forman's crusade, Thomas Carpenter, a Kansan, demanded an explanation from the church's presiding bishop in New York. Carpenter charged that the church had veered recklessly from its responsibility of providing guidance to its youth, fighting drug abuse, sexual license, and the erosion of authority and rampant crime. He explained, providing funds to a self-appointed revolutionary who has vowed to destroy our country and its institutions is a validation of violence and sets a most regrettable example for our young people. In a follow-up letter, Carpenter identified an air of intimidation about the church's handling of the Forman matter that makes submission to his demands tantamount to blackmail. A broad range of black persons disagreed with such comments, instead welcoming Forman's bold actions at Riverside. The Radical National Committee on Black Churchmen strongly endorsed Forman's manifesto because it believed that reparations finally would provide African Americans with what they termed adequate resources of power. It proclaimed Forman a modern-day prophet. The committee explained, reparation is part of the gospel message. Zacchaeus knew well the necessity for repayment as an essential ingredient in repentance. If I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. Luke 19:8. The church that calls itself the servant church must, like its Lord, be willing to strip itself of possessions in order to build and restore that which has been destroyed by the compromising bureaucrats and conscience-less rich. Although awarding reparations could never undo the pain and guilt slavery caused over centuries, this committee nevertheless judged it a positive response in need for power within the black community. This nation and a people who have always related the value of a person to his possession of property must recognize the necessity of restoring property in order to reconstitute personhood. The committee not only supported Forman's demand for reparations, but admonished him to broaden his campaign, to broaden it to include corporations, foundations, the U.S. government, and black congregations, not just well-off white congregates on the Upper West Side. An ad hoc black caucus of 35 national black churchmen, leading black churchmen, similarly endorsed Forman's reparation demands. There's no question but that the American religious establishment was the conscious beneficiary of the enforced labor of black people during the period of one of the most inhuman forms of chattel slavery the world has ever known. The white churches and synagogues undeniably have been the moral cement of the structure of racism in this nation, and the vast majority of them continue to play that role today. The black churchmen reminded white folk that many warnings of the past went unheeded. They are now only echoes receding in the distance. It is too late to call for propriety and moderation. A radical challenge has been placed before us on the threshold of a summer of unmitigated discontent in crisis. Lucius Walker, Jr., a black Baptist minister in Manhattan, on Manhattan's West Side, supported Forman's agenda because he no longer trusted white liberals to uplift the black urban poor. It's not their conscience is we're trying to move, it's their money. If we had received those 40 acres and a mule like we were promised, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today. Walker admitted his own frustration at penetrating what he called the white mentality. He said, "I dress properly, and my diction is correct, and I don't scare them, but I'm not getting through to them. Maybe it takes a guy who breathes fire, like Forman," close quote. Black theologian Oscar Holder of St. Mary's Episcopal Church outside of Philadelphia, defined reparations as a moral obligation, an ethical demand by those who have not upon those who have. For more than 100 years of racial exploitation, Holder considered the Black Manifesto bold and arrogant, but by no means unthinkable, because Forman framed it on the supposition that whites believed and trusted in the spirit of justice and fair play, and that whites also suffered from guilty consciences for their past treatment of people of color. Holder disagreed with those who interpreted reparations as a mere scam, a scheme, a financial scheme. Instead, Holder judged financial compensation as yet another dramatic effort by blacks to focus attention on both their plight and their determination to explore and exploit every possible means and avenue by which they can advance. Holder thus interpreted reparations less in the realm of what he called financial transactions and more as challenges to observe and justly deal with anything that has a bearing on what may be literally termed the vital statistics of Negro citizens. Holder observed that reparationists also were beginning to seek compensation from businesses as well as churches. And while it is easy to say that this is simply and purely blackmail, this will not suffice in the context of the present civil rights revolution, since logic is not one of the weapons used by combatants on either side after the battles are joined. Holder, who advised corporate leaders, this is very interesting. Actually, his wife, his widow is still alive, and I tracked her down in the suburbs of Baltimore. He was a churchman, and he had his own church, but in the early 1970s, he freelanced as an advisor to white corporations on how to deal with the racial tensions that their members, that these black corporations had experienced. I'm not sure whether it was for the profit motive or if it was goodwill. But this Holder's a fascinating fellow. And this widow sent me his papers, his clippings. She said, "I hope you put them to good use." And God knows I'm trying. Holder, who advised these corporate leaders, implored them not to offer blacks short-term pacifiers or tranquilizers, but rather a permanent cure to their economic and social ills. When people are in pain, poverty, or confusion, their very plight and terrifying prospects may prevent their knowing the extent of their problem, much less the solution. They will most assuredly cry out for help. However, the kind and degree of assistance offered them will depend upon the sensitivity and wisdom, as well as the material resources of those who respond to the appeal. Having said this, many African Americans opposed Forman's reparations project and vehemently, as you will soon hear. None were more outspoken than an anonymous black correspondent from Upper Montclair, New Jersey, which is a very tony part of the New York metropolitan area. The correspondent considered the Black Manifesto insulting and Forman's behavior at Riverside reprehensible. And there's some raw language here, and these are all, of course, direct quotes. "You contemptible creature," the writer began. Of course, I already said, this is an African-American person. "How could you do such a dastardly act? Your planned banditry under the guise of religion. For shame, for shame. $500 million in permanent damage is the only $500 million we will ever receive, you loathsome and detestable nigger." Double exclamation points. "Why don't you hurry and go back to Africa and try your financial hocus pocus on your headhunting and cannibal relatives before the cultured, respected, and influential colored folk in America crate you in a box and send you there on the first outgoing cattle ship? You apparently are just too stupid to know that if it has not been for the white man, you could still be scampering and also grunting and squealing as you swing from limb to limb through the trees of the African jungle. You are just a despicable guerrilla nigger doing the greatest permanent damage to millions of us cultured and refined colored folks who are diligently working so hard for full colored recognition and to receive the respect of America." Of course, that's one long quote. The letter writer assured Forman that they were mildly expressing the sentiments of thousands of fine colored folks in Montclair and of millions of colored and white throughout the entire United States. You can imagine how I almost fell out of my chair at the Library of Congress when I found this letter. I never in my life would have imagined. I understand people disagree on ideology and actions, but I've never, and I've studied racial thought for 4 decades plus, I've never seen anything like this. It's shocking. It's shocking to hear, it's shocking for me to present, but I think it's an important idea to be heard about the intra-racial conflict that has always raised its head among African Americans, as we know in all groups. And I think it's important to try to consider all sides of this story. More thoughtful mainstream Black Americans, however, objected strongly to Forman's call for reparations. They denounced his tactics, his hyperbolic, proto-revolutionary, anti-capitalist language, and his threats of violence. I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress going through the voluminous NAACP papers. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People unequivocally opposed Forman's manifesto. In June 1969, speaking at the NAACP's annual convention, Bishop Stephen Spotswood, chair of its board of directors, denounced Forman's program as, quote, "an illogical and illogical, diversionary and paltry way out for guilt-ridden whites anxious to avoid the really hard and sacrificial decisions they must take." Spotswood informed his audience that America's white churches were gullible in blindly accepting what he termed the ideology behind Forman's Black Manifesto and his initial demand for $50 million and later expanded to $3 billion in reparations to be dispersed by the National Council of Churches to the Black Economic Development Corporation. Bishop Spotswood said, "In our long crusade, the NAACP never subscribed to the reparations argument. It is easy and it is emotionally appealing, but it is not the fairest way for this white generation to redress the wrongs still visited upon this black generation and its children. Instead, Spotswood admonished the white denominations to donate millions of dollars to promote equal opportunity for Black Americans, and to civil rights organizations with experience, skill, and a history of achievement, close quote. Obviously, he was referring to the NAACP. In September, Roy Wilkins, secretary of the NAACP, responded forthrightly to Forman's demand for racial reparations, a concept that Wilkins considered alien to the canons of both truth and democracy. Isn't it just plain old panhandling? He asked rhetorically. It may be raised to the billionth power, but is it not just begging? Reparations, Wilkins argued, constituted a snare and a delusion whose inevitable failure would have disastrous consequences. In Wilkins' opinion, no amount of reparations conceivably payable by the nation's churches can either compensate for the Negro's wrongs or bring him into the just and equal society he seeks. Rather than reparations, as Forman had proposed, Wilkins endorsed a massive infusion of federal monies into Black communities, at least akin to that proposed by A. Philip Randolph's Freedom Budget, which some of you are familiar with, which called for nearly 200 billions of dollars over a 10-year period. Taking an indirect swipe at Forman, Wilkins charged that to give money to Black claimants who are without credentials or competence for their professed aims is to show contempt for Black Americans generally, because it says that where Negroes are concerned, incompetence and mediocrity are acceptable standards. Another strong piece of evidence about the NAACP's historic and ongoing opposition to reparations. Defending the NAACP's long record as a leading civil rights organization dominated by African Americans, not Caucasian Americans, Wilkins lashed out again indirectly at Forman and Forman's supporters. We know the forces which have brought the civil rights issue to the place where a handful of Black clergymen can demand and be promised $1 million by one church organization. Not until about 15 years ago was the NAACP able to raise $1 million from its membership to continue the kind of work that has made possible the flowering today of Black caucus demands and threats within church bodies for millions of dollars to be handed over and spent assertively to secure the civil rights of Negro Americans. So here you're seeing this intra-class and caste conflict within the African American community. 8 months later, John Morsell of the NAACP's, he was the NAACP's assistant executive director, reaffirmed his organization's strong opposition to reparations. In Houston, Texas, Morsell lashed out at Forman's demand that white denominations allocate funds to Black-led church groups. He singled out the Episcopalians for accepting the reparations piece of Forman's manifesto, while rejecting other elements that espoused militant radicalism and racial separatism. I have no patience with persons who say that the Forman Black Manifesto has some parts they don't agree with entirely. And like Wilkins before him, Morsell expressed his displeasure with white denominations elected to distribute funds to newly formed groups that had apparently overlooked the so-called old line or moderate organizations such as the NAACP and the other leading African American group trying to uplift economics for Black men and women, the National Urban League. Morsell rejected allegations that these groups had failed in reducing ghetto frustrations and hence were unworthy of funding. Denying that he was making an explicit plea for funding NAACP programs, Morsell nonetheless insisted that if white churches do not cherish the NAACP's eternal commitment to radical change by democratic, nonviolent methods in which interracial partnership is basic, there can be little hope for the future. I'm just going to give you a few more examples and then draw this to a conclusion. Black radical nationalists leveled their own criticisms at Forman. Again, intra-group disagreements. Where I'm going with this is the debates over reparations today are not new. They've been going on, and I find them earliest in the late 18th century among black communities in New England. Omar Abadel, Richard B. Henry, founder of what some of you probably know about, the Republic of New Africa, complained that not only was Forman's focus on churches and synagogues misdirected, but his document consisted of little more than, quote, counter-revolutionary idiocy, close quote. Some of you may have heard of Queen Mother Audley Moore, a legendary figure in the slave reparations movement since the 1950s, and a radical, former Marxist, former communist, and she's still revered by reparationists today. She was a very important figure in the 1950s slave reparations movement. She faulted Forman for first failing to consult with her. How could you do this without checking with me? And for demanding not too much money, but too little money for planning to distribute, and that she was upset that he planned to distribute the money too narrowly. She judged Forman's redistribution of wealth campaign too conservative. Bayard Rustin, who organized the 1963 March on Washington and served as the first field secretary of the Congress of Racial Equality and also as an important advisor to Martin Luther King, Jr., also looked askance at Forman's proposal, considering it, quote, a ridiculous idea, close quote. He accused Forman of hustling, these are his words, begging. Listen to this. If my great-grandfather picked cotton for 50 years, then he may deserve some money, Rustin said. But he's dead, and nobody owes me anything, close quote. Rustin found reparations attractive as a concept, but as a program, he considered it impractical and politically reactionary. Certainly, he said, the idea of compensating blacks for their unjust treatment by whites seemed sound as a principle of justice. But Rustin insisted reparations as an idea was, quote, equally a call for retribution, and as such, it has become more a moral than a political demand, close quote. Rustin found unpersuasive the argument that blacks would gain financially from reparations, the $15 per nigger, close quote, in Forman's own words. This pittance, if ever given, would hardly balance the wrongs committed against black people, nor would it appreciably improve their present situation. Rustin also doubted that most African Americans even wanted reparations because such payments would smack of charity. They preferred to work with self-respect. Justice will be embodied in their attainment of an equal social position, not in the flagellation and self-flagellation of white people. Finally, Rustin judged reparations to be reactionary. It would alienate the blacks' natural political allies, poor, working-class whites. If poor, working-class blacks got the money, how are poor, working-class whites going to react? In the end, Forman's Black Manifesto convinced mainline white churches, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Lutherans, and others to pledge millions of dollars to black church programs as atonement for past sins. Although he dismissed Forman's revolutionary and militant rhetoric, the Reverend Ronald Goetz, editor of a publication some of you know, The Christian Century, interpreted him as one of many strange prophets in history and urged readers to interpret the Black Manifesto as a blessing, not a curse. Like Audley Moore, you'll remember her, he found astonishing that Forman had demanded so modest an amount of money to repair the incalculable damages caused by centuries of slavery and racial discrimination. Until we admit that racial equality can never be achieved in this country, unless the radically oppressed are given special help to catch up educationally and economically, the oppressive pattern of racism will continue. In the short run, then, Forman won few converts to financial reparations for black persons, and by December 1969, he abandoned his campaign, discouraged and depressed. I found in his papers at the Library of Congress a handwritten autobiography, and he was very depressed. He felt he was a failure, and he never was a real activist and leader in the African American world after this. His words: "There must be some other way to obtain resources for revolutionary development other than by the route we have taken with this call for reparations." This was in his diary. What is frustrating is the knowledge that one has to confront racists with their racism, to look out into the audience and observe the faces of those bureaucrats and church administrators is more than my emotions can take at this time. It was his decrescendo away from all of this. But as a means of stimulating conversation, often sharp-edged debates, as I've tried to suggest tonight, about what whites owed blacks, the Black Manifesto proved to be a smashing success, writes Thomas Shugru, the American historian. Forman's bold action and hyperbolic language at Riverside sparked heated discussions in white churches nationally, churches often disinclined to discuss the plight of blacks generally or the question of reparations in particular. Most significantly, Forman's manifesto underscored divisions among white liberals over how best to respond to the economic demands of black persons. According to C. Eric Lincoln, Forman, his words, placed a miroir noir before the conscience of American Christianity and forced it to look at its own blemishes, close quote. Although many contemporaries considered Forman's tactics and message startling, in fact, the content of his manifesto was thoroughly capitalist, hardly revolutionary. That said, while Forman correctly sought wealth-producing assets to secure black uplift and a new social and economic order, he targeted churches instead of the U.S. government and the mega-capitalist corporations of 1960s America. That's where the real sources of wealth resided and reside. These, along with banks, insurance companies, municipalities, states, universities, and other institutions, as you know, would become the targets for reparationists in the next century. Thank you. Thank you. You know, the topic of reparations never elicits conversation, does it? And my talk tonight, I hope, suggests the kind of conversation that was just going on in a little corner of my research. I'd be glad to respond to questions the best I can, if you want me to.
Take a water break. I'll step over here.
I would love a water break.
So I have a two-part question. Roughly around this period, around the late 1960s, this is when the Black Theology Project, James Cone, and others
Yes,
getting underway. Did you come across anything in your research that Forman had any contact with some of those folks within the Black Theology movement, and did he gather any support there? And the second part of my question, what do you think accounts for the fact that Forman always butted heads with middle-class, mainstream black leaders? Because this is not the first time this has happened. He butted heads with SCLC
Yes.
in Selma. So what do you think accounts for that?
I think it accounts for his own self-righteousness, his own belief that he knew what was best, and he considered himself always more radical. He always thought he was the smartest kid in the room.
Yeah.
And he had no interest in that black theological movement. He felt that he was not interested. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So my question is, with the ongoing conversation of reparations today, is the best, I guess, way to go about it theological, or is there a more secular avenue to
That's a wonderful question. The route that has the most potential for any success would be the economic approach at corporations. And as you may know, early in the present century, when I started this work, and I was going to be writing a very short book until I dug deeply, I hope you could sense. The movement was against insurance companies and corporations that and there were lawsuits, none of them which really panned out. And that's all going to be in my book, these cases. And there's all kinds of litigation against corporations that, for example, insurance companies that in the 19th century insured the lives of slaves for slave owners. You were talking about your family's experience with slavery. And of course, this had been hidden. And of course, the insurance companies didn't want to talk about it. All kinds of big name corporations, insurance companies that many of you probably have policies with or are owned by subsidiaries, that kind of thing. That's where the private sector is going to come in. It hasn't yet. We know, however, and I'll give you two examples. You may have read about this in the national media. Evanston, Illinois, has come up with municipal benefits. The first thing you have to do is apologize for slavery. The United States has never really done that. Bill Clinton, if you read Bill Clinton's alleged apology, it was all over the rhetorical map. He could not say that the United States apologizes for the enslavement of 4 million people and the horrible legacy. Remember what W.E.B. Du Bois said in his famous 1935 book, Black Reconstruction. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Bill Clinton wouldn't apologize for that because he knew the political ramifications back home. And he did this on a conference in Africa, which the United States pulled out of because the European countries were saying, yeah, we apologize. And what are we going to do about international slavery? But I don't think the U.S. government's going to do it. I don't think the U.S. government wants to do it. Evanston, Illinois, small place, it's on the west side of Chicago. They are offering municipally funded low-interest mortgages for black families, and they have apologized. The town near where I live, Asheville, North Carolina, very progressive, left-wing. They've apologized for slavery, although there weren't many slaves in that part of North Carolina. They've taken small steps toward limited reparations, apologizing for slavery and offering, again, low-interest mortgages and grants to black Americans. I don't think the theological, I'm not a student of modern theology. I don't know the percentage of people who still go to church and how they identify with their churches. That's for somebody else to study. But I don't think that's the way it's going to be. And I think Forman figured that out. The response wasn't what he expected. I'm not sure really what he expected. Thanks for the good question. Yes, ma'am.
So are you saying that you think that these smaller communities or smaller scale programs for reparations would be the best route?
I didn't say that. I just said that that's what's going on now. Yeah, that's what's going on. And on a bigger level, like California, see what people have done is there's been an ongoing study group in the House of Representatives. This has been going on for 20 years, and now a majority of people in the U.S. House of Representatives has enthusiastically passed a bill to study the feasibility of reparations. That's the closest the federal government has ever come. It's a study. It's a study. And Evanston, Illinois, home of Northwestern, wealthy people live there. This isn't the proletariat, So it's easy for these kind of places. If you've ever been to Asheville, it's a vacation retreat for wealthy people who've discovered how nice it is there and cool in the summer. I don't see much prospect for reparations. And I'll tell you why if you'd like to know my view. I've been thinking a lot about it for a long time. As much as I believe that Americans must make right their historic wrongs, I consider mass systematic reparations unrealistic and unworkable. The following questions suggest only a few of the reasons that reparations most likely will not come. I wanted to mention a colleague of mine. He's now at Duke. You may have heard of him. He's the economist Sandy Darity. He's just written a book on reparations. Unlike my work, Sandy Darity's work is advocacy. I'm not advocating anything. I'm a historian who asks those questions and does the research and tries to explain what it's all about. The so what. That's what we historians do. So what? That's what we teach our students to figure out. Well, Sandy Darity recently has proposed an encompassing reparations program that the government, the U.S. government, should fund $10 to $12 trillion. $10 to $12 trillion. And the students here might want to check out Professor Darity's book. His name's William Darity, D-A-R-I-T-Y. UNC Press published the book. So he says to make this work, the government has to come up with $10 to $12 trillion, from which, and here's the key word, every eligible Black African-American household would receive approximately $800,000. That's his proposal. Well, think about this. How would we define who are the eligible Black Americans? Who would receive the compensation? Should all Black persons receive funding, including immigrant or voluntary Black Americans, people, Africans? I had a colleague from Malawi. He's retired now. University College London, PhD. Was one of our Africanists at NC State. And my wife was German and is very interested in ethnicity and nationalism and identity. We had Owen over for dinner, and my wife, again, the Europeans have different takes on a lot of these things. And she asked Owen, are you now an African American, or are you an African? Well, that's the question here. Who is eligible for this? How could persons prove their slave ancestry? By genetics or by archival evidence? And who's going to do that? What form should the proposed compensation take? Cash awards? Darity suggests baby bonds for each child born to an African American family, that the government creates a baby trust fund for the future. Low interest loans like what they're doing in Asheville and in Evanston. The current U.S. debt exceeds $27 trillion. And it's hard to imagine that the U.S. Congress would authorize Darity's proposed $10 to $12 trillion for reparations funding. President Biden has proposed a $2 trillion infrastructure program designed to help all Americans. And that program, as you all know, remains very much stalled in Congress. I know this sounds like a pragmatic explanation, but I think it is a pragmatic explanation. In some, at least for me, and I'm not in the advocacy business, but I knew this question was going to come up. How could it not on a topic like that's so divisive and volatile, given all the racial violence and all the heartache and all the horrible things that has happened within the last decade in this country's history? In some, it's hard to imagine that in spite of slavery's direful legacies, Congress would compensate African Americans, who constitute 12% of the population, compensate them for our country's original sin. And to be honest, I doubt that a majority of white Americans would endorse a reparations program for Black Americans. I hate to say that. But let me be clear. Reparations in some form or another are justified. But I fear they will remain a pipe dream, one whose time perhaps will never come. Yes, sir.
Dr. Smith, what's your take on the Poor People's Campaign led by Dr. Barber?
Yes.
As I understand, I'm a participant, I'm a supporter of that movement myself.
Yeah.
Not existentially and theologically and spiritually, I'll wholeheartedly support it. And it understands itself as an act of reparation by righting the wrongs of the system.
That's right.
And I mean, is that one answer to the question about the reparation?
Well, he's one of my heroes. He's in Raleigh.
He's from North Carolina.
Yeah, he's in Raleigh. There's a preacher there. He's been arrested and all kinds of things with him. But one of the themes in the book I'm working on is that reparation becomes a symbol. It becomes a metaphor. And it has many houses. And there's the house that wants cash right now. And there's one that's going for the long term, to look at, to parse all the connected but oftentimes separated elements of white supremacy and its legacy. And what he's doing is publicizing that. But it's not just on race. He's looking at all kinds of questions, but as you know better than I, all kinds of questions of gender, police violence, lack of transparency, unequal schools. Not surprisingly, where there are poor people, there are fewer taxes, and the school systems aren't so good. And he's looking at a macro view, not the micro view of cash payments.
Right. Well, yeah, and as I understand it, the problem is reparations is a judicial concept, that is getting compensation. But from the Poor People's Campaign, it's a matter of overall justice and equity, which is a grander and a broader concept.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But again, I paid a lot of attention to the idea of reparations as an idea, and it's been used a lot. And don't let me get started on the 40 acres of land. You had a question? I'm sorry, the lady with the blue has her hand up here. Oh, I thought you were asking a question. Oh, thank goodness. Yes, ma'am, you want to ask me a question?
So now I have like a kind of 2-for-1 question.
A 2-for-1?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like 2 of them.
Only in Murray do I do that, 2-for-1.
So part of the question is, with how current technology is, with like being able to trace back your ancestry with ancestry.com, Humphries, et cetera, and what records may be available to some people, would they be able to theoretically prove their own enslavement that way? And then the second question then is, would their form of reparation then be the ability to almost like take back the intellectual property or even like these photos and texts used in our learning of enslavement? Because it makes you think of the lawsuit
Right.
However, when she tried to take up a lawsuit to try to claim ownership of that building, a Massachusetts state judge dismissed it on the grounds that she didn't have a claim necessarily.
Yeah. Well, as the other gentleman, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, said so rightly, reparations is a legal construct. And that's one of the problems. To address your first one, yeah, I suppose, I don't use things like census because I go and look at the original records and I don't trust this computerized program, which also knows that it's a for-profit thing. And we historians don't make any profit on anything either. So. Do I have historians? No. We're just toilers in the woods here, doing the work. But there's a movement underway I just read about. You can't imagine how much has been written about reparations. This is why it's taken me 15 years just to get to this point. But there's a movement underway to go after a group that we can identify. These are the former slave holding families. And go after their beneficence for them that wasn't beneficent for the slaves. And many of these families, still have lots of wealth. About the intellectual property, I'm not sure about that. It's very, have you studied comparative restitution of artwork in Europe from the quote, there's a book entitled The Rape of Europa. The Nazis took all this stuff from all over Europe and buried it in salt mines. And then it got sold. Not only did the Nazi leaders themselves sell confiscated, stolen goods, artwork, you name it, silver, gold, wealth of Jewish and Hungarian and communists, and it wasn't just Jewish people who died in the Holocaust. About 8 million people, perhaps more. It's very hard to prove the provenance of these things. So I won't say it's easy to say, but it's certainly hard to do. What was your second question?
Oh, the second question is basically like, would a form of reparations in the modern era be reclaiming artwork or texts or pictures of these slaves if you can prove you were a descendant of them?
I guess. I think it would be an uphill battle. But one thought, based on your good question, I have a whole big section on the universities and reparations. Some of you probably follow these. And the best of those documented examples is the Jesuit school, Georgetown University. The Jesuits who founded Georgetown owned hundreds of slaves. And if you know anything about the Jesuit archives, those folks have kept everything. They have kept everything. And there's now investigated, well, it's finished now. So anyway, and I have some of my best material in my book. They did all these interviews with the descendants of slaves that were owned by the precursor of Georgetown University. So what has Georgetown done? They've identified who the living descendants are and are giving free scholarships, if desired, to the descendants at Georgetown University. So there's one woman, and I don't have the details up there. It's in my manuscript. I don't know, I think she's 55. So last year she was a freshman at Georgetown. In the dorm, And it's a wonderful story. And all of a sudden now, even UNC Chapel Hill, at NC State, the school we love to hate, Chapel Hill. Well, who built the stone fences around the historic campus? Slaves. William and Mary, University of Virginia. We know about Yale. We know about Harvard. All this stuff's coming out now. Oh, it's been coming out for years. It all depends how you define reparations. But as much as I would like to think that the federal government could do something about it, I think that's highly unlikely. So maybe this grassroots effort will be more successful. Read Darity book, you'll find it interesting. It's going to be there. And if you want to write me, I'll give you the citation. Yeah, you can find me in the UNC Charlotte website. And Dr. Humphries will tell you when I say I got to write somebody. No, not Jim. Jump to attention, Jim. Anybody else?
Well, I've got to ask this.
Yes.
We have a controversy in Callaway County about a statue.
Yes, I've heard of it.
Yes. It seems like just taking it and putting it somewhere is a very small act of reparations. Because it's on a courthouse square, black people pass by, it hurts their, they don't like it. We don't have that many black people
Yes.
in Callaway County. But that's just a small way of
repairing the damage.
And then one other thing I want to ask you, how could Murray State do a smaller way of reparations?
A small what?
How could you do a small act that would represent reparations? I mean, could you give affirmative action to black scholarship, black people that might need scholarship?
Well, I can't really intelligently respond to the first part of your question. There are two sides to the story, and it would be a small act of reparation. But what are you going to do with the statue?
Well, we want to put it in another place. It's not public property. I mean, they can put it out there next to the city.
Who commissioned this statue?
The
Sons of Confederate Veterans?
And they don't want to move.
They don't want to move.
They've even whitewashed it, got it all cleaned up.
I see. Well, destroying public property is not a pretty good
We don't
thing.
want to destroy it.
No, I'm not saying you, but people who face these things. This happened in Durham, North Carolina. People attacked this. It was on the courthouse grounds, and they defaced it and yanked it down. At Chapel Hill, the famous Silent Sam, he's been removed. You may have heard last week the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Monument Avenue, where they had all these Confederates. Those are acts of reparations. But they're also acts against history. You know, the Nazis burned books. Because if you burn books, then you don't have people challenging their ideas. So are we in the business of taking the artifacts of the past, which suggests the Jim Crow era? That's when the UDC started doing all that stuff. Right. It wasn't right after the Civil War. A colleague of mine has written a book on this, Karen Cox.
Yes.
So as a historian, I see these artifacts of our racist past as documents. But I am not an African American who walks by these things. The Germans, and I have taught overseas and lecture a lot in German because of family connections and my professional connections. The Germans have outlawed the Hakenkreuz, the swastika. You can't publicly display this. You cannot put it, this is lighten the discussion. A few years ago, Hermann Göring's Unterhosen, you may have read about this. Somebody found some of his what do they call those? Oh no, it's under the Lederhosen. They're not briefs, they're boxer shorts. That's what they're called. And it had a swastika on it. I hope they had been cleaned before they went to this auction house. But the Germans put swastikas on everything. And it's against the law in Germany to exhibit it. And I found a few in Göttingen. I'm a little sniffing around looking for it. Well, of course, that leads to the question about civil liberties in terms of freedom of speech, and also in Germany has led to an increase in neo-Nazi. Once you tell somebody you can't do something, they want to do it, of course. A lot of places have tried to deal with this artifacts of the past by having right next to them counter presentations. University of Kentucky, my alma mater, has in Memorial Hall, I don't know, any UK grads here that are willing to admit it? Welcome! Here it is.
Oh, wow, I got one of those.
I got a Murray State one now. I'm going to wear that probably back at UNC Charlotte. They're going to find it very exotic. And I'm tooling around campus with Murray State regalia. And I will. University of Kentucky Memorial Hall, the icon of the campus. They have a mural there on the entranceway. And it charts the history. And it was hand-painted a long time ago of the university. And surprisingly, there are renditions, images of slaves, waiting on people and carrying stuff. Well, this was a big blow-up at UK 10 years ago. So what did they do? They had a counter panel, or panels, I haven't seen it, to integrate it or tell the other side of the story. I don't know if that satisfies people or not. But, and I'm not saying what you folks should do. I haven't been back to Raleigh in a long time. If you go down Hillsborough Street, dead ends into the, in Raleigh. I don't expect any of you except James, you know what I'm talking about. And they have, it's the state capitol, and they have this big monument to Confederate soldiers and sailors. And municipalities, it doesn't make it less important here, but municipalities are dealing with this all over. And as a historian, I have to think it bigger meaning. There are many meanings. And which trumps what? I don't like to use that as a verb, sorry. But I really do. I felt, yeah, I know. I don't know. But your question, the second question about what could your university do? I don't know. The provost is here. You can answer this. Have you decided to have?
Hang on, let me move over here.
I have seen there's been a swell of new positions at universities, vice chancellors for diversity. I don't know if you have that here or if there's a movement. UNC Charlotte has that person. And I'm seeing in the Chronicle of Higher Education, this is becoming more and more common. So you could do what the U.S. government has done and the state of California has done, is have a commission. The problem with commissions, if you've ever been a faculty member or worked at a university, you have lots of meetings and lots of commissions that oftentimes don't accomplish very much. And people talk past each other and all that kind of stuff, and there's a lot of performances, you know. So I don't know. You could have a commission. You may have something like that with undergraduates and graduate students and faculty from the full cultural and ethnic spectrum, and that would be the commission or the area, the locus of that kind of discussion. Institutional histories on African Americans at the university, in this community. The old way to do this would famous African Americans of. That's sort of a very old way of doing it, and I don't know if that's gone on here. I've talked too long, but there's a gentleman who has another question. They're going to get the hook out any moment.
I just wanted to clarify something that Ms. Easley said, and in your response to her. This monument, nobody wants to destroy it. Nobody wants to deny its historicity. They want to move it to some place where it can be interpreted.
I see.
Remain a historical art.
I see. Oh, I'm glad you said that.
Well,
where's that place going to be?
Well, it could be the city cemetery. It has to be a public place.
Yeah.
It could be the city cemetery, but the county judge refuses to allow anybody, said we don't have the money to move it. Well, you know, in other words, it's not an insurmountable problem to move this thing. They're just people
Has
who are
anyone done
stubborn.
research on this particular item? The UDC, by the way, is not flourishing these days. People have defaced their headquarters in Washington and all that. But it'd be very interesting to find, has anybody researched this?
Well, we know where it came from. We
Yeah,
know
but how and when and the newspapers, it's all been done.
There was a water fountain that said Black's Home.
Oh, yeah.
And that was there, but the water fountain was there, but it was not.
Okay, I'm sorry about going there. But if you'd like to continue talking to Dr. Smith, you're welcome to join us outside. I believe we have some of your books.
Oh,
If you'd like to buy one of Dr. Smith's books, he'll autograph it for you.
I did bring a pen.
And I'd be happy to talk to anyone about what was so reading and with their studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.